This move immediately claims central space, opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, and prepares for rapid development, setting the stage for many popular and dynamic opening systems. This move, 1, c6, initiates the Caro-Kann defense, a solid choice that aims to reinforce the d5 square and prepare for a robust pawn structure, while avoiding the immediate tactical complexities often found in other defenses to 1, e4. This move develops the light-squared bishop and supports the central pawn on e4, aiming for a flexible pawn structure characteristic of certain modern defenses like the King's Indian attack or a reversed Caro-Kann. This move immediately challenges White's central pawn and opens lines for Black's pieces, reflecting a typical pawn structure fight in the Caro-Kann defense. Developing the knight to d2 supports the d3 pawn and prepares for further piece activity, potentially aiming to control central squares and maintain a flexible pawn structure. This move initiates a fianchetto of the king's bishop, aiming to control the long diagonal and create a solid defensive structure, often seen in setups that may transition into a king's Indian or Perk-like defense. This move develops the knight to a natural square, supporting the central pawn advance and preparing for kingside castling while maintaining flexibility in the pawn structure. This move fianchettos the bishop, aiming to control the long diagonal and support the central pawn structure, characteristic of a king's Indian setup. This move prepares to fianchetto the kingside bishop on g2, creating a solid pawn structure and controlling the long diagonal in a manner often seen in systems like the king's Indian attack or certain variations of the ready. This move develops the knight to a natural central square, preparing to castle and support the pawn break in the center. This move continues White's solid development, preparing to fianchetto the bishop to g2 where it will control the long diagonal and support potential kingside castling. Castling kingside is a natural developing move, completing the kingside pawn structure and connecting the rooks while safeguarding the king. Castling kingside completes White's initial development, securing the king and preparing to connect the rooks for future action. This move develops the bishop to an active square, aiming to exchange it for White's potentially strong kingside bishop or to create pressure along the g4a2 diagonal. This move challenges Black's bishop, forcing a decision about its placement and potentially disrupting Black's harmonious development. Black's bishop exchange on f3 strategically simplifies the position, opening the g-file for the rook and removing White's actively placed knight. This move recaptures the bishop, centralizes the queen, and prepares for future pawn advances on the kingside, creating a solid pawn structure. This move develops the knight to its most natural square, preparing to support a central pawn advance and potentially redeploy to a more active square like c5 or b6. The queen repositions to e2, clearing the d1 square for the rook and supporting the eventual advance of the e-pawn, while also maintaining a watchful eye on the kingside. This pawn exchange on e4 opens the d-file for Black's queen and knight, potentially creating dynamic play and influencing the central pawn structure. This pawn exchange clarifies the central pawn structure, opening the d-file for potential piece activity and creating a more flexible pawn majority for White on the kingside. This move develops the queen to a central square, supporting the d5 pawn and preparing for potential queenside expansion or a central pawn push, while also connecting the rooks. This move prepares to expand on the queenside, aiming to create space for pieces and potentially attack Black's queenside pawns, which have a somewhat passive structure after dxe4. This move skillfully repositions the rook to an open file, aiming to increase pressure on white's central pawn structure and potentially support a future d5 pawn push. This move proactively repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to contest the crucial d5 square and support a potential c5 pawn push in the future. This move initiates a fianchetto setup for black's queenside bishop and prepares to challenge white's centralized knight and potentially expand on the queenside. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to increase pressure on black's queenside and prepare for potential pawn advances. This move challenges white's central control by creating an imbalance, aiming to exploit the semi-open c-file once the pawn is exchanged. This move aggressively challenges black's queenside pawn structure by aiming to open the a-file and create weaknesses for black to defend. This move directly challenges white's advanced pawn on e4, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and open lines for black's pieces. This knight repositioning aims to challenge black's solid pawn structure and potentially support a kingside attack or central expansion. This move repositions the knight from d7 to e8, initiating a maneuver to challenge white's central pawn structure and potentially control the d6 square, while also preparing for future pawn breaks or knight outposts. This pawn sacrifice opens the a-file for your rook and creates a passed pawn on the b-file, initiating a strategic fight for central control and piece activity. This pawn recapture opens the a-file for your rook, creating immediate pressure and challenging white's control of the queenside territory. This knight retreat to b1, while seemingly passive, aims to reposition the knight to a more active square like c3 or d2, supporting pawn advances or targeting weaknesses in black's position after the exchange on a8. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, preparing to contest the b-file and potentially support a pawn advance on the queenside. This knight repositioning to c3 aims to control the central d5 square and prepare for potential advances of the b-pawn or rerouting the knight to a more active square like e4 or d4. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to support potential pawn breaks on the queenside and contest control of the c5 square. The knight's repositioning to b5 is an aggressive maneuver aiming to exploit the weakened c7 square and potentially pressure black's queenside pawn structure. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, connecting the rooks and preparing for potential central pawn advances or pressure along the c-file. This move exchanges white's knight for black's knight on a key central square, simplifying the position and potentially opening the c-file for future play while preparing to contest control of the d5 square. This recapture re-establishes the central pawn presence and prepares to contest the open c-file, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses on white's queenside. White repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially preparing to attack the weak c5 pawn or exert pressure along the open c-file. This move activates the rook on the open a-file, contesting white's control and preparing to potentially pressure white's queenside structure. This move solidifies the queenside pawn structure and prepares to challenge black's centralized knight with a potential b4 push, while also creating a safe square on c2 for the queen if needed. Black exchanges rooks on the a-file, simplifying the position and potentially freeing up the c7 square for its queen or knight in future moves. This recapture on the a-file activates the rook to a more central and dangerous position, preparing to contest control of the open file and potentially pressure black's queenside. The rook now retreats to b8 to defend the b6 pawn. which is currently attacked by white's knight on c3 and the queen on b5, and to prepare for potential counterplay on the b file. This move activates the rook onto the semi-open a file, targeting the pawn on b6 and preparing to exert pressure along the queenside. This move develops the bishop to a better square, preparing to connect the rooks and contest the important open c file while also eyeing the potential weaknesses on the queenside. This move activates the bishop to a more central square, improving its scope and potential to support a kingside pawn push or control key diagonals. The king now moves to a more active and safer square, preparing to join the defense of the queenside and potentially support a kingside pawn advance. Later, the move Ca4 aims to exploit the potential weakness of black's c5 pawn and prepare for kingside activity by repositioning the queen to a more aggressive diagonal. This move seeks to reroute the rook to a more active square, potentially by way of b7 c7 or b7 a7, to challenge white's control of the a file and support potential queenside pawn advances. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the weakened dark squares around black's king and preparing to support potential pawn advances or piece activity on the kingside. This move reroutes the knight to a more active square, aiming to support the b-pawn advance and potentially create threats along the queenside. The rook aggressively penetrates to the 8th rank, threatening to decimate black's queenside pawn structure and exploit the weak b6 pawn while simultaneously restricting the enemy king's mobility. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to control key squares and potentially support advances or exchanges on the queenside. This move repositions the queen to a more flexible square, anticipating potential pawn advances on the queenside or preparing to support a queenside expansion of its own. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to contest the central files and potentially support pawn advances on the kingside. This move repositions the queen to a more central and active square, preparing to potentially support an advance on the kingside or coordinate with the rook on the now open c-file. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to create weaknesses and open lines for attacking the black king. This move exploits the unprotected king and the compromised dark squares around black's king, aiming to disrupt the defensive setup and potentially create tactical opportunities. The king retreats to safety on the h-file, avoiding the immediate danger of the bishop checking and allowing for potential counterplay on the kingside later. The bishop on g5 is now strongly positioned to restrict black's king's movement and potentially control the f6 square after further piece exchanges. This move aims to redeploy the rook to a more active square, potentially supporting pawn advances or preparing to contest the open c-file should it arise. White captures the rook on b8, eliminating black's active piece and centralizing white's rook on the open b-file, aiming to exploit the newly created tactical possibilities. This recapture re-establishes material equality and repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to control key squares and support potential pawn advances. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control key central squares and potentially support an advance on the kingside or exploit the newly opened diagonal after the rook exchange. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to contest the d4 square and potentially support a c5 pawn push, aiming to challenge white's central control and create counterplay. This move activates the queen to a central square, preparing to infiltrate black's queenside pawn structure and potentially attack the weak b pawn or create new threats along the light squares. The knight repositions to a7, aiming to control the c6 square and potentially challenge white's bishop on f6, while also preparing to support a potential b5 pawn advance to gain queenside space. The bishop retreat to e8 is a crucial defensive maneuver, reinforcing the vulnerable g6 pawn and preparing to potentially shift the knight to a more active square like f6 or e7, aiming to improve king safety and coordinate defense. The king moves to a more secure square, avoiding potential checks and preparing for defensive maneuvers as white's bishop now controls the critical g6 square. This sacrifice of the bishop is a decisive tactic, forcing the black king out into the open and aiming to expose it to further mating threats after the queen re-enters the attack. The move 38, qxf7 accepts a significant material sacrifice and opens lines for the opposing king, indicating a willingness to embrace sharp complications for potential counterplay. This move decisively resolves the material imbalance and simplifies the position, leading to a favorable endgame for white due to black's exposed king and lack of active pieces.